Alright, and we are back. So we've primed the miniature and let it sit for a little bit, and now we're going to go ahead and put on our first coat of the blue. This is McCrag Blue. It's a base paint from Citadel. So what we're going to do is make sure before you start using it to shake up your pot. And the reason we want to shake up the pots of paint is so that any paint that's settled, we're just kind of mixing everything together so we have a uniform color that we can work with. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the brush, the Citadel base brush again, and now what we're going to do is just take the paintbrush and put it in here and brush it on. Now as we paint, you guys will notice back here I have something with some red and black on it. This is my wet palette. A wet palette is basically a piece of foam or sponge. You can use tissue, not tissue, but a paper towel covered with either wax paper, baking sheets, or wet palette paper. That's basically to keep the paint wet and prevents it from drying up so quickly. You guys can see that the paint is fairly thick. You don't really want to paint the miniature with super thick paint like that. So what you could do is to take some sort of palette. You don't have to use a wet palette. You can even use a piece of tile, kitchen tile, if you want, or the inside of a Chinese food container. It's basically to just transfer the paint over. This way you can add a little bit of water to it to help make the paint flow a little bit better, right? You don't want to just paint straight out of the pot because otherwise the paint will be too thick. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and actually base coat the miniature. Now another important step in painting, in my opinion, is how you actually base coat or put the paint down. You don't want to use a very thick amount of paint on the miniature. It's much better to put down 2 thin coats rather than 1 thick coat. This way, 2 things. One, it'll help keep the details in place when you put the thin paint down, so you don't cover up all the detail work. And 2, it'll actually help the paint dry a little quicker, so that way you can go back and do that second coat. If you put a thick coating down, you might have to wait a little bit longer for it to dry. So again, what I'm doing is I'm just transferring paint over to my palette. This one happens to be a wet palette, adding some water to it, and then coating the mini with without really worrying about the coverage of thickness. Kind of like I was talking about with the primer. You want just a thin layer where you show that you've covered the miniature with paint, but that it's not so thick that it obscures and hides all the detail. So base coating here with McCrag Blue. In this video with this miniature in particular, what I'll do is I'll paint the miniature with the paints provided and do a very simple tabletop version, which any painter, whether you're beginning to learn how to paint miniatures or if you're new as a veteran, I'm going to just use this miniature as a tabletop version miniature. And what I mean by that is we'll do what's written on the box set, what Games Workshop has provided. And this is the first step that they've provided, which is to paint the basic base coat of blue. Obviously going forward, as you gain experience in painting and layering, there's other things like blending. You can actually add a lot of highlights and shading to it, but that's further down the line in your miniature painting experience and journey. But if you're just starting out, we're just going to base coat and follow the instructions on the box just to get your feet wet, just so that you know what it feels like to put some paint on the brush and then to put the paint down on a model and what it feels like. Okay, so as we are painting up the first layer, because I painted it fairly thin, parts of the sections that I've already painted prior has dried up already. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go back and do another coat, and we'll just add that second coat on there so that the blue that's being laid down right now is becoming a very nice consistent blue without any streaks of primer showing through the blue. And after your second coat, you can always assess the miniature, go back and take a look, and if you feel that it needs even a third coat, you can layer it a third time as well. There's no harm in layering it. Again, because if the paints are done thinly enough, you won't really hide the details. And obviously, painting miniatures, you do not want to hide the details. You want to see every detail there, so that you have all these other great paints and highlighting and shading that you can do to accentuate certain features of the model. But if you put a thick glob of paint down and you hide all those details, then basically all you're going to be showing and presenting is a miniature with a thick glob of paint on there that's dried, and that's not what you want to showcase. I believe as a painter, as an artist, you want to showcase, to the best of your abilities at least, your skill in showing all the details of a miniature with great precision, without harming the actual product itself or getting rid of any features. You want to showcase the features rather than destroy the features on a miniature, and paint can do that if you put too thick of a coat. So again, make sure you put down thin coats. 2 coats should be fine, but if you feel like you need to go in with a third, a very thin light coat on the third pass should be sufficient, and you won't have to worry about all the details being distorted or being hidden. Now, unlike the primer, the reason you want to go in with the second or third coat is because you do want full coverage. You don't want to show the black primer through the miniature. Unlike with the priming stage where I said it was okay to show a little bit of that primer, when you're painting the base coat, you don't want to show the primer. So with that being said, that's why I'm doing multiple stages here. And again, as you're doing it from one side to the other, some of the parts of the miniature might dry, so you can always go back and add a couple more layers as you see fit. But with that, I'm pretty much done with the actual base coating stage. So now what I'm going to do is let this sit and dry completely, and then I'll come back and we'll work on the next stage, which will be to shade the miniature. Okay, so with the power of editing again, I'll see you guys back on the other side. Okay, so now that we have the base coat completely done and dried, the box set says to use the gold and the white to paint on first and the silver before you wash the model, but I'm going to actually go out of step a little bit, and I'm going to actually wash the model first. I like to wash the model in stages, so that what I mean by that is once I got all the blue done, I want to wash or shade the blue first, let that dry, and then come back and pick out all the details like the gold, and then wash that, and then I'll pick out all the silver and then wash that as well. So this is the Agrax Earth shade that's provided. So we're just gonna take this here. Now you can dip the brush in there and then just brush it down. But just like with the blue paint, what I like to do is add a little bit of water. I'll swell up the brushes just a little bit with water and mix it in with the ink wash. And the reason I do that is I want to dilute the wash just a little bit further so that it's not as concentrated. And so what that does, it'll help with some areas of the models where the wash will dry to be a little lighter and other areas to be a little bit darker. And the heavier pigments of the wash will settle down, so the wash will float downwards with gravity, and that'll help pull the pigments down as well. So you'll kind of get a natural fade or transition from just adding a touch of water onto the wash. And again, what I'll do is I'll just add the entire, or not the entire bottle, but I'll add layers of wash through the entire model. As you can see right here on the shoulder pad, right? So I'll pull this off, and then when I lay it back down, it'll start settling down, and you see that it's starting to pool up again. Just giving it a little time, it's starting to pool up. You really don't want to have pools of of wash like that. So you do want to go in and dab the paintbrush on that area, and then try to pull up as much of that wash as you can. Again, we were talking about it with the base coating. You don't want to obscure all the details, and you know, you did a lot of work and put a lot of time in with the base coating to try to keep the details. The last thing you want to do is to go in there with a wash to give it a little bit more detail and actually hide the detail by letting the paint pool and dry. So like for example here, we want to try to clean that off, because if we let the wash sit there and dry, you're going to get these like splotches of blue, and then you're going to have the brown where the wash dried. So again, just be thorough as you're painting through the miniature. Keep an eye out in areas where you feel that the wash is pooling too much. You can actually go there and pull some off with the brush and then spread it out. Or if you feel that you need more, you can actually add more wash as well. So like right now, I'm just adding a little bit more straight concentrated from the bottle, just to make sure that I get some areas a little bit thicker. Okay, so like here, there's too much. I'll pull some of that off here. Especially the eye. You don't want to cover that with too much wash, because we'll have to go back in there with a little bit of paint later on. So a lot of painting happens to be about judgment call. That's where your artist expression comes in, is to make the judgment. Hey, I want the miniature a little darker. I want it lighter and more vibrant. You know, I want to add more wash to it, or I want to pull some of the wash off. And that really comes down to your judgment as to how you want to paint the miniature. Okay, now with the thing with washes is that once you do lay it on, you do have to give it sufficient time for it to dry. If we were to go on and start painting the next layer on top of this, it's going to actually pull and peel some of the wash off, and then what you'll end up getting is like this, what we call lake effect, where you'll have the wash that dries out and makes this ring, and then you'll have the blue, and that's really difficult to fix without having to really start over. Very hard to fix. So just let the miniature dry completely before you go in and start a second layer or so. Okay, but as you can see, some of the areas of the wash have started to dry, like parts of the shoulder pad here, where the wash hasn't been sitting in the what I call valleys, but between where the armor plates sit, where it's nice and dark, you do have to again leave yourself sufficient time for that wash to dry before you come back and start up on the next layer. Sections like here on the foot where I feel like I can use a little bit more, you know, you can always go and add more. Just remember, you can add more, but to take away is much harder. So keep that in mind, and that's why we thin our paints and take our time with the miniature. Okay, and again, with that, I'm gonna let this sit and dry for a little bit before we come back and start hitting the model up with a little bit of the gold and silver.